So today I want to talk about something that I think is the most important geopolitical shift of our generation. You have likely seen the breaking headlines about Donald Trump's Middle East peace plan failing and the panic across Western media that Saudi Arabia is suddenly turning to China, not the partisan bickering in Washington, not the daily fluctuations in oil prices, and not the trending surface-level diplomatic theater you see on the news. The most important question is this: why is Saudi Arabia, America's oldest, wealthiest, and most critical ally in the Middle East, actively dismantling the American-led global order? And the answer, when you look at it carefully, is deeply unsettling. The foundation of American financial supremacy is collapsing. It cannot dictate terms, it cannot force compliance, and it cannot stop the pivot to Asia. To understand what is happening right now, you need to understand the concept called the petrodollar system. Let me explain this simply. The petrodollar is not a physical currency. It is a geopolitical agreement. Back in the 1970s, the United States made a very simple, brilliant deal with Saudi Arabia. America would provide the Saudi royal family with absolute military protection. And in exchange, Saudi Arabia agreed to sell its oil exclusively in US dollars, because every country on earth needs oil. Every country on earth suddenly needed US dollars. This forced the entire globe to hold American currency, which gave the United States the unprecedented power to print money and borrow endlessly without destroying its own economy. Think about the collapse of the British Empire. That unraveling started in 956 during the Suez Crisis. On paper, Britain had the military power to secure the canal, but the financial realities of the world had shifted. The United States threatened to sell off the British pound, crippling their economy. Britain realized almost overnight that military might means absolutely nothing if you no longer control the underlying financial system. Why? Because the nation that controls the reserve currency controls the limits of global power. But here's what makes the current Saudi pivot to China even more catastrophic than the British collapse at Suez. In 1956, global supply chains were relatively simple. Today, they are inextricably linked. China is not just offering an alternative currency, it is offering an entirely alternative world order. So let us imagine Washington decides it wants to punish Riyadh for turning toward Beijing. It decides to play hardball. It threatens to withdraw military support and isolate the kingdom. Now, on the surface, some people might say, America supplies the Saudis with all their weapons, just cut off the arms sales and they will beg for forgiveness. But here is why that thinking completely misunderstands the situation. If America attempts to punish Saudi Arabia, a terrifying chain reaction begins. Step 1. The United States freezes all maintenance, spare parts, and future deliveries of advanced fighter jets and defense systems to Riyadh. Step 2. Saudi Arabia does not capitulate. Instead, it immediately signs massive procurement contracts with Beijing to replace American hardware with Chinese hypersonic missiles, drones, and air defense systems. Step 3. Now here's where it gets really serious. In retaliation for the American embargo, Saudi Arabia announces that it will begin pricing 30% of its daily oil exports in the Chinese yuan. Step 4. Global central banks panic. Realizing that the dollar is no longer the exclusive currency of energy, nations from Brazil to Indonesia begin dumping their US Treasury bonds, meaning they are selling off American debt to buy Chinese currency instead. Step 5. As the world stops buying American debt, the United States, which is currently sitting on over $34 trillion in national debt, sees its borrowing costs skyrocket. The interest payments alone consume the federal budget, triggering a sovereign debt crisis that collapses the American standard of living overnight. This is why Washington cannot simply punish Saudi Arabia. It cannot use the old playbook, This is the coercion trap. But here is where it gets really serious for America. So, if punishing Saudi Arabia destroys the American economy, why not just offer them a better deal? Why doesn't the current administration just give Riyadh whatever it wants? A formal mutual defense treaty, civilian nuclear technology, and absolute security guarantees to pull them back from China. Let us look at what happens if the United States suddenly binds itself entirely to the defense of the Saudi kingdom. In the 1990s, America maintained a light footprint in the region. 20 years later, after the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, it had spent trillions of dollars, lost thousands of lives, and eroded its own military readiness, only to watch the region become more unstable than ever. If Washington signs a binding defense pact with Saudi Arabia today, it legally obligates American soldiers to fight and die for Saudi borders. It means the United States must maintain massive permanent carrier strike groups in the Persian Gulf. Exactly when it desperately needs those ships in the Pacific to deter China, that is a trap of imperial overstretch, and it is one of the most fatal diseases a superpower can catch. It is the delusion that tells leaders we can police the entire globe simultaneously, regardless of the financial or military cost. The imperial overstretch trap makes defending the Middle East ruinous, but the financial reality makes abandoning it terrifying. And that is where the true Chinese strategy reveals itself. Now let me tell you what happens next, because this is the part nobody is talking about. And now I want to tell you something that most mainstream coverage is completely hiding from you. Saudi Arabia's pivot to China is not about trade. It is about a fundamental transfer of hard power. According to intelligence reports that have been quietly circulating in defense communities, China is not just buying Saudi oil. China has been actively helping Saudi Arabia build its own domestic ballistic missile manufacturing facilities. Let me say that again. China is physically building ballistic missile factories on Saudi soil. Why does this matter? Because for 80 years, the American strategy in the Middle East relied on a monopoly of high-end weapons. If an ally misbehaved, you cut off their supply. But China is not just selling weapons. It is transferring the capacity to build them. Beijing is systematically immunizing Saudi Arabia against American sanctions. They are making it mathematically impossible for Washington to exert leverage over Riyadh ever again. This diplomatic collapse does not exist in isolation. It is connected to everything else happening in the world right now. From the expansion of the BRICS economic bloc to the de-dollarization efforts in South America, we are witnessing the final, undeniable end of the unipolar American moment. So what is the solution? What does Washington actually do when its greatest regional ally walks away? The only viable path forward is to engineer a controlled descent. It requires Washington to stop viewing the Middle East as an American protectorate and to begin aggressively transitioning its own domestic economy away from its reliance on the petrodollar. It requires competing with China on economic value, infrastructure development, and technological innovation, rather than relying on outdated military coercion. That is not a surrender. That is strategic maturation. It accepts reality, it preserves capital, it recognizes that in the 21st century, you cannot force a sovereign nation to buy your debt if you are no longer offering them the best future. Whether American leadership has the humility and the foresight to take that path, that is the most important question of our time. And honestly, I do not know the answer. Let us recap exactly what we have covered today. The petrodollar agreement is unraveling because Saudi Arabia no longer relies exclusively on American military protection, which leads to a direct threat to the US dollar's dominance. Punishing Saudi Arabia fails because an arms embargo pushes Riyadh to price oil in yuan, which spikes US borrowing costs and threatens an American debt crisis. Appeasing Saudi Arabia is a trap because of imperial overstretch, which forces the US military to bleed resources in the Middle East while leaving the Pacific totally exposed. The hidden truth is the technology transfer, because China is actively building missile factories inside the kingdom to permanently immunize Saudi Arabia against US leverage. The only way out is a controlled transition, because America must adapt to a multipolar financial world rather than destroying itself trying to maintain an outdated empire. Subscribe for more analysis of global geopolitics explained in simple English. Tell me in the comments, do you think the US dollar will lose its reserve currency status within the next 5 years? Or will America find a way to save it? I will see you next time.